Okay, let's take a look at a real LSAT writing prompt, because once you understand the structure of these prompts, you'll be able to pull out the information that you need much more quickly. So this is from PT80. Tony, a beer brewer, is deciding whether to start a production brewery or, on the other hand, a brew pub. This paragraph is what I call the setup. LSAC does not call it the setup, but it's always the same. LSAC will just lay out two choices for you. And again, in this case, it's whether Tony should start a pub or a brewery. Next comes the criteria. So we get two choices, and then we also get two criteria that we can use to choose one or the other choice. Everything works in twos on LSAT writing. We get two choices, two criteria, and then we'll get two paragraphs of information, one for each of the choices. But we'll take a look now at the criteria. So criterion number 1, Tony wants to develop a reputation among critics and connoisseurs for fine beer. And criterion number 2, Tony wants to be able to devote time and resources to developing new beer offerings. So he wants time for beer R&D. After the criteria comes the substance of the prompt. You get two paragraphs of information, and again, one for each of the two choices. And these paragraphs are going to give us facts that let us argue for one choice or the other based on the criteria. So, of course, LSAC won't call it this, but basically the first paragraph is always going to be a list of pros and cons, or a list of facts that you can interpret as pros and cons for the first choice based on the criteria. And the second paragraph is what you can interpret as a list of pros and cons for the second choice. And just to give you a sense of how formulaic this can be, let's go ahead and sort these sentences, because for every single prompt, you'll be able to take each sentence and you'll be able to affix a mental label based on what criterion it speaks to. And you'll be able to call it a pro or a con. Now, sometimes that's up for debate. Sometimes you can argue that one is a pro or a con. But as an exercise, let's go through this. So right here, I've broken out each one of these sentences into cards, and then I've labeled it with the criterion that I think it speaks to. Here's the first one. A production brewery would be able to distribute its products to a large geographic area. So I think that has to do with the criteria number 1. Tony wants to develop a reputation among critics and connoisseurs. I'll argue that if he distributes his beer widely, it's going to be easier for him to develop that reputation. And so I'm going to say that this is a pro. In order to get the brewery's beers to be carried in stores or offered at bars, Tony would need to put time into sales and marketing. So this one speaks very clearly to the criteria. Time is a zero-sum game. And if Tony is putting time into marketing, then he has less time for his beloved beer R&D. So this is clearly a con, and it has to do with that second criteria. There are already a large number of breweries that distribute to the area. So this one's interesting because we know it's a con. It can't be a good thing if there are a number of breweries. At least that can't be an argument in favor of building a brewery. But which one of these does it speak to? I'm not sure. I said that it speaks to criteria number 1, reputation. And I said that because I would perhaps argue that if there are a lot of breweries, then it's going to be harder for Tony to develop a reputation among critics and connoisseurs. They have, more options. So I'll call this a con. A production brewery's products are likely to be reviewed by beer critics. That's clearly a pro, right? We know that he wants a reputation among critics and connoisseurs. I guess the only way it's a con is if his beer is terrible. And if his beer is terrible, I don't think he can possibly fulfill either of these criteria anyway. A production brewery would initially need to focus on a small number of core offerings. So that is definitely a con. I think it's hard to interpret this as a pro. If the brewery has to focus on a small number of offerings, at least initially, then he has less time to develop other kinds of beer. And the last sentence says, if these prove to be popular, that is, these beers, these core offerings, then Tony would be able to introduce a series of experimental limited edition beer offerings. So you'll see this a lot too. This sentence doesn't quite stand alone. This sentence is related to the previous sentence and it mitigates the previous sentence. A lot of times LSAC will give us a pro or they'll give us a con, and then they'll give us a factor that you can sort of say, well, but on the other hand, and you can use it to sort of hand wave the opposing evidence. I'm going to call this a pro. Okay, so we've categorized everything in the brewery pros and cons. And let's look at the pub's pros and cons. And we'll do the same thing. We'll sort all of these sentences. So first, a brew pub would draw most of its customers from the local area, which has few brew pubs. Notice that this directly reflects the sentence in the first paragraph about how breweries have a lot of competition. Often, the second paragraph is sort of the inverse of the first paragraph in so many ways. If breweries have high competition, pubs have low competition, and that's clearly a pro for the pubs. Tony would need to oversee the day-to-day operations of the restaurant side of the business. That's a con, because if he is spending time on the restaurant and the operations, then he has less time for his beloved beer R&D. So I'm going to drag that over here. And this, by the way, is the counterpart of one of the cons over here. Just as with breweries, Tony would have to spend some time marketing. So with pubs, Tony would have to spend some time managing. They really sort of balance each other out. And you'll see this as you look at more prompts. It's usually just as easy to argue for one side as it is to argue for the other side. Okay, next sentence. Tony might be able to hire a restaurant manager. This is what we talked about above. This sentence really mitigates this one. Although he would need to oversee the day-to-day operations of the restaurant, at least at first when he's starting out, when presumably he has less budget for a manager, eventually he'll be able to hire a manager and somebody will take those duties off of his hands. So that's a pro. Many customers at brew pubs are interested primarily in the food. Ooh, that's a con because Tony is no chef. Tony is an artiste of beer. And I think he wants to spend his time making beer. He doesn't want to spend his time making food to appease his customers. So I'm going to drag that over here. And I'm going to say that it speaks to this criterion that he wants time to develop beers. Brew pubs are more likely to be reviewed by restaurant critics than beer critics. That really piggybacks off this sentence. If he opens a brew pub, then he has to spend time on the food. And Tony, he's not a food man. He's a beer man. On the other hand, beer connoisseurs enthusiastically seek out brew pubs and they share information about them on all the socials. Well, that's a pro because if Tony wants to develop a reputation among critics and connoisseurs, he'll have a chance to do that if he gets good social media. This is, yet again, a counterpart of a sentence up here. I think we saw up here that a production brewery is more likely to be reviewed by, a production brewery's products are likely to be reviewed by beer critics. And the criterion says that he wants a reputation among critics and connoisseurs. So if he does the brewery, he has a chance for a great reputation among critics, or at least a chance to be reviewed by them. If he does the pub, he has a chance to be reviewed by connoisseurs. It splits the criterion. It's just as easy, I think, to argue for one or the other. Tony would interact directly with customers at a brew pub. This sentence is highly interpretable, but I'll say that if he interacts with customers, it's going to be easier for him to develop a reputation among beer connoisseurs because some of his customers are going to be connoisseurs and, Tony has a chance to charm the pants off of them. So I'll drag it over here to the pros. Finally, brew pubs brew batches of beer in relatively small volumes and they can rotate their offerings relatively quickly. This is a direct counterpart to one of the cons over here. We learned that a production brewery would initially need to focus on a small number of core offerings. Not so for the brew pub. For the brew pub, he's agile, he's nimble, he can adjust, he can, throw oranges in there for Halloween, for Oktoberfest. So this is a pro, and it speaks to this second criterion. He wants to be able to devote time and resources to developing new beers. Now, not that this is really how you would ever decide which one to write, but in my tally, the pub has 6 pros, the con has the pub has 6 pros and 4 cons. And let's see over here. The brewery has 4 and 4. So the pub, in my reckoning, has slightly more pros than cons, but it's pretty split. You can see a lot of red and a lot of green in either. And that's because it is usually just as easy to make an argument for one of the options as the other. And it's really imperative that you just pick one. You don't spend too much time dithering.